¿Y por qué se huyen? ¿Ah? De que nada deben hacerme, maldito. ¿Qué? ¿Qué? ¿Por qué estoy privado por tu culpa? Solo nos viste y saliste corriendo, maldito. Nunca debes de poner tu mano.
Security forces in El Salvador have become the terror of gangs. Since President Nayib Bukele took office, state agents have captured tens of thousands of criminals with enormous brutality, causing them to experience the same violence that is an essential part of their crimes. However, not even the most extreme measures carried out by the government are enough to end the horror of the savage maras. These ruthless groups have defied authority, taking their misdeeds to new levels of cruelty. The episode that occurred in June 2022 in the La Realidad neighborhood is a clear example of this. 3 police officers were patrolling the area when, suddenly, they found themselves involved in a fierce confrontation against gang members, brutally armed and thirsty for blood. The scene soon turned red and unleashed a fierce fight to catch the aggressors. In this new video from Military Force, we will go through this event full of cruelty. We will discover how it ended and learn about the enormous war that President Nayib Bukele is leading against the most feared criminals in El Salvador.
Pues ahora van a ver de verdad lo que significa desatarle la fuerza del Estado a estos criminales. No vieron nada en estos 2 meses y medio de guerra contra las pandillas, porque lo que se les viene es mucho mayor.
Our journey through this story begins on June 1st, 2019, with a difficult promise to keep. That day, Nayib Bukele became the president of El Salvador, and he assured that his government would put an end to the dangerous maras, the most infamous criminals in the country. They had turned that land into the most dangerous nation in the world, robberies, rapes, and a lot of death. Since the beginning of the 2000s, the security forces worked to stop the members of these groups, but for every man they lost, they added a new member and returned with greater violence. Without being at war, in 2015 the country registered a rate of 103 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Although there was a subtle decrease in crime over the years, terror was still latent when Nayib Bukele assumed office as president. It was not the first time that a leader announced the desire to end the terror of the gangs. However, despite the fact that several administrations had already tried, none of them succeeded. Finally, it was in March 2022 when everything exploded. The country experienced one of the deadliest weekends in its history. Between the 25th and 27th of that month, 87 murders were recorded. This sudden increase in brutality was again attributed to gangs, mainly Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, which have historically had a great influence on Salvadoran crime. Without wasting time, President Bukele reacted to this situation by asking the Legislative Assembly to implement an exceptional regime. This was a very important request because the measure implies, among other things, suspending some constitutional rights and granting extraordinary powers to the security forces. Despite having generated great controversy throughout the population, the president obtained the necessary political support and put the new regulations into effect. In this way, they began to carry out massive and ferocious arrests. Under this exceptional regime, the government of El Salvador has adopted violence as its main tool. Since its implementation, among the thousands of criminals arrested, many have ended up behind bars without a court order. The state claims that these arrests are directed against members of the gangs and accomplices associated with these criminal organizations. In any case, within the new rules, there is no obligation to give explanations to those who are deprived of their freedom. A simple suspicion is enough to place a pair of handcuffs on them. As if this were not enough, extreme restrictions have been imposed in prisons, such as the confinement of prisoners in their cells, the suspension of visits, and the cutting off of communications. And to this are added more severe penalties for crimes related to gangs. According to the Bukele government, the main objective of this regime is to combat the violence generated by the aforementioned groups, reduce crime, and restore security and order in the country. To achieve this, the law was initially declared for a period of 30 days, but due to the large number of criminals present in El Salvador, it has been extended again and again until all the organizations are dismantled. This is a violent war that the nation has committed to fighting, putting itself at the level of a brutal adversary. When we talk about the Maras, we are referring to some of the most feared organizations in Central America. To the surprise of many, their origins date back to the 1980s and take us to the city of Los Angeles in the United States. There, gangs were formed made up of immigrants from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Many of its members ended up in prison for their criminal acts. However, after serving their sentence, they were sent back to their countries at the end of the 1990s. The criminals who arrived on Salvadoran soil found an unstable social and economic context where unemployed and desperate people leaned towards the world of crime. This allowed them to continue growing and to give shape to the main groups, the Mara Salvatrucha, also known as MS-13 and Barrio 18. These gangs are involved in all kinds of crimes, from robberies and kidnappings to murders and drug trafficking. To carry out their activities, they cooperate with dangerous Mexican cartels such as Sinaloa and Los Zetas. All this terror imparted by the Maras is what has led the government to opt for a hardline regime.
Nuestra sociedad tienen que ser expulsados, tienen que ser erradicados de todas nuestras comunidades. Siempre es más importante la vida de un policía y la vida de un soldado frente a la vida de lacras como las que tienen ahí hincados ante ustedes.
The arrests carried out by the authorities are the result of a strategy that seeks to contain the enormous violence that has tormented the population for years. A large number of police and military personnel carry out operations in towns or cities controlled by gangs. Their way of acting is by creating a cordon around these areas, cutting off the gang's supply lines, and preventing their members from leaving the region. These types of tactics are followed by assaults on those identified as criminal strongholds. In this way, entire neighborhoods, colonies, and municipalities have been cleaned up. However, the missions do not always go as expected. On June 28, 2022, in the community of La Realidad, a forgotten corner of Santa Ana, the metallic sound of weapons broke the soldiers' successful routine. A telephone call to 911 had warned of suspicious movements in an area controlled by gangs. Inspector Carlos Mauricio Velasquez, his deputy inspector Franklin Antonio Lemus, and agent Marta Liseth Alas, as members of the emergency system, were called into action and were tasked with carrying out a preventive patrol in the area. They would never have imagined that they were about to be the protagonists of a day of terror. The police officers had also been informed about the alleged presence of a dangerous criminal who was hiding in a house in the community. Jose Hector Bernal Colocho, alias El Negro. He was a known criminal with a violent history and an essential part of the structure of Barrio 18, one of the most dangerous and cruel factions in the country. The officers approached the house where he was hiding, believing that they had managed to corner their target. However, the danger did not lie only in that individual. Armed gang members, strategically hidden, were waiting for the moment to attack. Suddenly, as the security forces tried to arrest Bernal Colocho, they were surprised by a violent and merciless ambush. The three police officers found the criminal they were looking for, but when they rushed at him to arrest him, they found themselves caught in a deadly trap. 5 criminals lurking inside the house unleashed an intense burst of fire behind the officers. It was a few minutes of hellish shooting that gave the officers no time to react.
Que ya hay dos compañeros fallecidos, un compañero y el señor su inspector oficial.
Por aquí andamos en la zona, hay un inspector ya fallecido y una compañera al parecer fallecida también en la escena.
Velasquez and Lemus died immediately in the fierce attack, while Marta Alas, seriously injured, was taken to the hospital where she died hours later. The 35-year-old woman was the newest member of the force and longed for Salvadoran children to be able to live in a safe environment. Her great dream had been extinguished as a symbol of the violence she sought to combat. In fact, the ambush was a clear example of the type of brutality that has marked the recent history of El Salvador. Gangs, such as Barrio 18 and MS-13, exercise severe territorial control in vulnerable areas, using fear and death as tools to dominate the population. In this case, it was in the community of La Realidad, a place where many of the houses are marked by precariousness and have long been a refuge for these criminal gangs. The daily life of the neighbors developed between intimidation, constant threats, and forced silence. The response of the government led by Bukele to the heavy losses and bloodshed was immediate and forceful.
Van a pagar caro por el asesinato de estos 3 héroes que dieron su vida para proteger a la población. Si ellos piensan que esto va a los pandilleros, pues, y sus aliados internacionales y nacionales, si ellos piensan que esto va a hacer que retrocedamos en la guerra contra pandillas, se equivocan. Y son tontos realmente, aparte de asesinos y despiadados, son tontos.
The murder of the 3 agents intensified the actions of the country's authorities. That same night, the president ordered the mobilization of the armed forces and the national police in a massive operation to capture those responsible. The Minister of Security, Gustavo Villatoro, reported that more than 300 soldiers and state agents had been deployed in Santa Ana, with the support of armored vehicles and advanced surveillance technology. President Bukele's order was clear: to finish off the gangs that still had a presence in the area. During the following hours, the security forces carried out multiple raids. They went through the neighborhoods, breaking into the different homes suspected of providing shelter to the gangs, and finally managed to capture the 6 criminals who participated in the massacre. Among them was Bernal Colocho himself, who had been injured during the confrontation. In addition, other people were arrested for collaborating with the gangs, both adults and minors who helped the criminals. Among those arrested was Sonia del Carmen Villalta, who was allegedly in charge of hiding the gang members in the community. The violence of this ambush and the subsequent response of the government highlighted the intensity of the conflict between the state and criminal organizations in El Salvador. Repressive actions, such as the militarization of the affected areas and mass arrests, are part of a broader strategy that seeks to eradicate gang violence in the country. These tactics were taken to a new level after the murder of the 3 police officers. Security operations, increasingly, began to include the excessive use of force by the authorities, beatings, arrests without apparent reason, and the dangerous use of weapons in the middle of the street. Although this method allowed the capture of thousands of gang members in an attempt to dismantle the criminal networks that have devastated the country, it is not without controversy. The president's strategy of direct repression against criminals has succeeded in reducing homicides and increasing arrests. However, some critics point out that these measures do not address the deep roots of the problem. Poverty, lack of opportunities, and social exclusion continue to fuel gangs, creating a cycle of violence that seems difficult to break with force alone. Faced with this, the international community and human rights organizations have expressed concern about abuses committed under the state of emergency, including arbitrary arrests and inhumane conditions in overcrowded prisons.
Han despertado, ya lo decía el presidente, toda la furia. Ninguna de las canciones que andan cantando los organismos internacionales en pro de la defensa y los derechos de estos criminales nos va a hacer cambiar nuestra estrategia. Al contrario, vamos a duplicar, triplicar o cuadriplicar nuestras acciones en el territorio. Si pensaron que este era un estado débil y que íbamos a ceder a presiones internacionales, se equivocaron.
Without listening to the demands of humanitarian organizations, the Bukele government has built a mega prison known as the Terrorism Confinement Center, or CCOT. Although it was designed to house 40,000 criminals, more than 70,000 have already been held there. This prison is located on a 166-hectare site, guarded day and night by 600 soldiers and 250 police officers. It has 8 pavilions equipped with cells in which up to 80 inmates are locked together, who live crowded and without any kind of comfort. At bedtime, they use beds that are made of iron sheets, without mattresses or pillows, a cold, hard surface to start and end the day. In addition, the CSAT does not have training spaces to play sports or develop a trade, so criminals spend 24 hours a day completely locked up. Finally, if anyone decides to overstep their boundaries, the pavilions are also equipped with so-called punishment cells, a small, dark, windowless room. There, gang members with bad behavior see their life reduced to 4 walls, and they cannot even appreciate the sunlight. As if that were not enough, in this case, the bed directly becomes a concrete platform. An ex-convict locked up in this place by mistake gave an overview of what life is like in this prison.
Es lo más cercano al infierno que puede haber.
¿Qué era lo que les daban de alimento?
2 tortillas de las que se dan para tacos. Eso era todo con una cucharada de frijoles. Tenemos que turnarnos para que unos durmieran, otros tenían que estar de pie. Dormíamos 3, 4 horas y a pararnos para que los otros descansaran también. Era bien.
This incredible space of confinement is the final link in Nayib Bukele's iron-fisted regime. Despite the challenges and criticism, the president continues with his policy, determined to eliminate the presence of the maras in El Salvador. The death of the 3 police officers in La Realidad became a symbol of the brutality with which the gangs operate and of the government's commitment to confront them, whatever the cost. The question, however, remains whether this approach will be enough to achieve lasting peace in a country that has been hit by violence for generations, or whether a change will be necessary that also encompasses the social and economic reconstruction of the most vulnerable communities. What do you think? Is the brutality of the Bukele regime the solution to the problem of Salvadoran gangs? Leave us your answer in the comments box below. Now, after having learned this story of death that only fueled the spark of a terrible war, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for accompanying us to the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next military force video.